Hi, Misha here, and kind of going backwards in time, it's time to get to the de Havilland Vampire, also known as the DH-100. This was the second jet ever in the RAF, but it actually had a lot of firsts to its credit. And this version here is the single-seater. This is the FB.5, the most numerous version built. And also in this video we will take a look at the two-seat version, which actually was pretty influential. This is the T.11, known as the DH-115, but actually there are very close relations to the NF Mark 10 night fighter, and even de Havilland's later Venom and Venom. So we'll get into that. The Vampire, it is overshadowed by Gloster's Meteor, which was the RAF's very first jet, and actually the only Allied jet to be functional in World War II. But the de Havilland was not far behind. Work began there in 1941. It was kind of speared forward by Sir Tizard. He took Whittle's work to de Havilland and proposed that they get into the jet game. And they had some spare R&D at the time and jumped on it as a private project. In the beginning, really didn't have any government support. Started off as the DH-99. It was kind of unique for being an all-metal plane, jet-powered. It would ultimately go with the Goblin engine. At first, the government wasn't too keen. There was a bit of an argument. De Havilland thought about maybe doing a bomber, to replace or update from the Mosquito, which they had a great deal of success with, so like a light, fast bomber. The government said, we want an interceptor because we're worried about Germans putting jets on bombers and attacking us. Gotta remember, this was, not long after the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, all that. So that's where they jumped off. Government had a few suggestions too. They said, hey, de Havilland, you're good at working with wood, so maybe go to wood and metal construction. It'll be great for wartime production. And so that led to the DH-100, originally known as the Spider Crab, which is really the direct ancestor of this here. It was a single engine, which is pretty radical for the time. They have these two intake ducts at the front of the airframe. And then they have the single jet exhaust in the back. This allowed for a much shorter cockpit area, making it a relatively light plane. We have, of course, this unique tail with booms. Otherwise, it's a pretty conventional, it's more or less a straight wing design. It does have a tricycle, retractable landing carriage. And even though the government initially funded this as an experimental proof of concept only, from the very beginning it was outfitted to take 4 cannon, typically the 20mm. But it eventually did get some government support to make prototypes. So by 1942 they were well underway. The Meteor was still the priority, but the Vampire was the second, the backup. Also, by this point, 1942, the threat of German bombers had been lessened, and so the Air Ministry came back to de Havilland saying, hey, about that light bomber, jet bomber concept, Well, by this point, de Havilland was pretty invested in making it a fighter-interceptor, so they kind of fought to keep it as such. There were a few early issues, but they worked them out. Long story short, by 1943, the prototype was rolled out, and it took a while to get flying because they needed to get a Goblin engine for it. The one they were going to use was actually destroyed by the U.S. How nice of them, during their own testing, so they had to get another one. They got it on, and then the Vampire, as it was starting to be known, first flew on September 20th, 1943, which was nearly exactly 6 months after the Meteor. So it was behind, but not by a whole lot. That said, de Havilland was very busy with manufacturing in 1944, and the Meteor was the prime project, so not a whole lot happened for about half a year. Finally, in May of 44, the government initially ordered 120. They decided to take this from the experimental stage to production. And then, just a very short time later, they upped their order to 300 for the RAF. And de Havilland built some, but the majority were built by English Electric, who had the spare production capacity. And the first production Vampire Mark I flew in April of 1945, so towards the end of the war. And by VE Day, 6 of them had been built and were completed, but they weren't in combat. The public did get to see the new Vampire during the Victory Day celebrations in London and elsewhere. So it was kind of its first premiere, and de Havilland, English Electric, kind of worked on fulfilling the initial RAF order. Another early interested customer was the Royal Navy. Originally, 3 prototypes had been built, where they took the 3rd prototype and they reworked it with equipment for carrier trials. And actually, in December of 1945, the Vampire became the first jet ever to take off and land on an aircraft carrier. So it was pretty impressive. This would enter into RAF service in 1946. And the Navy seriously considered the navalized version, known as the Sea Vampire, as its new standard fleet air-armed fighter. In the end, they went with the Sea Fury. They just weren't sure a jet was quite ready for prime time, but they did order about 22 single-seat Sea Vampires, and actually a number more of the T-22 trainer. I think it was around 60 or 70. So it did enter into limited use with the Royal Navy. We're still pretty much on the Mark I at this point, using more or less the same Goblin engine with only minor updates. 1948 was a pretty big year for the Vampire. In March, one of these that was modified with a new Ghost engine set a new world altitude record of nearly 59,500 feet. These planes were reaching 500 miles per hour in level flight. In July of that year, 6 Vampires crossed the Atlantic and were the first jet fighters to do so. And also, the Vampire was the first jet fighter to be issued to the British Air Reserve. Before that, they had been using pistons. These were first stationed by the RAF in West Germany, and then, of course, across the Empire. They would replace Tempests and Typhoons, as well as Mustangs, and they would complement the Meteor. We would go through the F3, which was a minor upgrade with an improved engine. The F2 was a concept that was never put past the prototype stage. And that would lead to the FB.5 here, which was a fighter-bomber variation. It had a more powerful engine. It was still a Goblin, but we're into the Goblin 2 now. It could carry 2 500-pound bombs on the wings. It could also mount up to 8 rockets. To do this, the wings were clipped by about 1 foot on each end, and also the undercarriage was strengthened. And this would be the most numerous produced version, with over 1,000 built, about 930 in the UK, and 80 some odd overseas under contract. It's kind of the quintessential Vampire. These would see quite a bit of use during the Malayan emergency, where they would particularly be used to kind of go and strike strongholds, refuges in the jungles, delivering their rockets and bombs. And that was pretty much it for the original Vampires. By the early 50s, pretty much all World War II era planes were looking outdated. But the Meteor got some pretty radical upgrades with the Mark 8, later the FB.5, and the reconnaissance and night versions. The Vampire really didn't see a whole lot of improvements. Again, it was the secondary choice. So these are more or less put in second string positions and then retired from active RAF service at the end of the Korean War in 1953. And again, these would be armed with 4 20mm cannon as well. Pretty typical loadout. It's a relatively conventional plane. It is wood and metal construction. It was fast. It was maneuverable at high speeds over 400 miles per hour, but it was a little tricky to handle below that. It was also a very cramped cockpit, and the instruments were not laid out particularly in an ergonomic fashion. It's a little hard to use, but it was an early jet and pilots still enjoyed it. And again, it was a smaller, lighter plane than the Meteor, and using only one engine, it was a little resource less intensive to build. And it was the first jet in the Royal Navy, even if it never reached the levels of success that others might have. And it did spawn several variations, some of them quite important. In some ways, the Vampire was perhaps more popular outside of the UK than it was inside. It was used by 31 air forces. 15 variants were made over the years. Really, the only major users not to go for it at all were West Germany, because, situation, and the USA. And I guess you could consider like Spain and the Netherlands, but pretty much every other major air force in the West had some of these. For example, they started to be sent to Sweden as early as 1946. There were a few different versions. They were known as the J-28A initially, which was essentially a Mark I. Then they would produce over 300 of the FB.5s, a version of it for themselves, known as the J-28B. They would even acquire about 57 two-seat trainers like this, known as the J-28C. It was very popular in Sweden and allowed them to retire their old propeller-driven planes by the early 1950s. It would also be sent to France starting in the late 1940s to help them rebuild their air force, and would be built under license by SUD, although the initial planes around 70 were pretty much all British, but then the remaining 180 or so ended up having more and more French customizations and parts, including a French ejection seat. And they would have two-seat trainers as well. Australia was another major user, and they produced a few under license themselves. Even Switzerland would acquire about 170 and then build another 100 themselves under license. So yeah, it kind of made the rounds on and on. The Goblin 2 would give way to the Goblin 3 in later versions. And ultimately the FB.5 would be replaced by the updated FB.9, which was basically a tropicalized fighter bomber for use in Africa. It would be used against dissidents, rebels in Kenya. And basically its features were it had air conditioning and had the newer engine. So what about this model here, the two-seater? It actually has an interesting history. This first flew in late 1950 and was accepted by the RAF in January of 1952 and started to be used. It kind of started off, though, as a whole different idea. It started off as the DH-113, 113, as a two-seat night fighter, night interceptor. They essentially took the cockpit from the Mosquito and kind of grafted it to the Vampire. They also extended the nose out to make room for a radar. That's what our second crewman was for, was to operate the radar. It was still armed with 4 20mm cannons, each with 150 rounds. While it was a tad bit longer, that's about it. It really didn't add a whole lot of mass or decrease performance. And an early customer was going to be Egypt. They wanted to buy these night fighters because they were having some issues with Israel. Well, the British government blocked the sale. They pretty much said no military arms going to Egypt. But as kind of a carrot and a stick thing, they took over the project and used this as a night fighter as the NF-10 or Mark 10. Basically, this was kind of a interim plane when the RAF uses the night fighter. The older Mosquito was going out of service by the late 40s, early 50s, and newer planes, newer night fighters, like the night fighter version of the Meteor, were not yet around. So they would acquire about 95 two-seat Vampires, first to be used as night fighters, but really where it came in to its own was as a trainer. To make the T.11, they essentially just removed the radar, and they set up a separate second set of controls in the cockpit for the student, and boom, trainer. And like I said, these would first be built and flown in 1950 and go into service in 52. Once the newer night fighters were coming online, some of the NF-10s would be updated to trainers as well, called the NF-T-10, basically making them into T-11s. And quite a few of these would be built. About 730, which was a lot for a trainer. There was even an export version, which was quite popular, known as the T.55, and a navalized version, as I already alluded to, known as the T.22. So it was a very popular trainer. While the main single-seat Vampires were retired out of the RAF, in practical terms, starting around 1953 and officially by 1956, the trainers would keep on training British pilots until 1965. Then they would be retained to train foreign pilots for export sales till around 1967. But by which time there were plenty more new modern trainers, and since production had ended a long time ago, they were just running out of parts and the airframes were just at the end of their service life. Remember, these are partially wood. The very, very, very last Vampires would be retired out of the RAF in 1971, and it was pretty much a similar story for foreign users. These would be retired out anywhere from the late 50s to the late 60s. Not at all a bad run, considering every place time mark, there were about 3,300 built. The plane is not very big, really. It's got a 38-foot wingspan, but it's only about 31 feet long. It's quite light compared to the Meteor. Its top speed was about 540 miles per hour. As I said earlier, a modified version set an altitude record at over 59,000 feet, but standard altitude was about 43,000 feet, give or take. A neat plane. Both of these models are from Corgi, 1/72 scale diecast. I joked before buying them that I expected them to be made out of metal and wood, just like the originals. Of course, they're mostly metal. The tail on both is plastic, and I assume they just did this to get the most detail. And I think that's still part of the reason, but also they said it's a balance thing. If this were to all be metal back here, it would actually throw the weight more towards the rear, and it would be hard to sit on a stand. So sometimes you have to have those kind of considerations when you manufacture. But the whole front end, the wing cockpit, is metal. We have crew figures inside, and landing gear can be displayed up or down as usual. It is a relatively small model just because scale, but that's kind of part of its charm. Where did I set the other one? There it is. I set it further than I expected. Burp. So yeah, this is the FB.5, most produced. This one's actually in Australian livery. And this one, the T.11, is British training. I think it's neat because it filled several roles, and it does harken back to the Mishaco, and I don't know, just an interesting look if you ask me. I've always kind of liked side-by-side seating planes. They look neat. Like that Hawker Hunter. Alrighty guys, well that was my extended look and history of the Vampire. This would lead directly to the de Havilland Venom and Sea Venom, which was very similar, but it had a swept wing, so a more modern wing style. And of course that would in turn lead to the Sea Vixen, which I do already have a video on. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.